In this video, we're going to show you how to get started with Python. This semester, we're using Spyder for our programming in Python. Before you go any further, we recommend that you install Spyder and that you configure it in the way that we've asked. Above the link for this video, you should be able to find a link to some configuration instructions. In particular, we want you to have just these two panes open. On the left-hand side, we have the editor, and on the right-hand side, we have the IPython console. Now, if you look at the IPython console, you should also see two things. One is up here, it should say Python 3. It doesn't matter what comes after the 3. What matters is that it say Python 3 and not Python 2. We've also asked you to change the input and output prompts. So down here, you should see 3 greater than symbols. That's the input prompt. That's not the input prompt that you get by default, but it's the one that we want you to use for this class. Now, you'll notice in the rest of the videos, both this video and the ones we're going to ask you to watch going forward, we use a different tool. We don't use Spyder. In particular, we refer to the Python shell. And the Python shell is basically the IPython console. It's the same thing. It's just that in Spyder, the shell is integrated into this larger package. So anytime we ask you to use the Python shell, we want you to use the IPython console. So for example, you'll see in the remaining video, we compute 2 to the 4th power. So here we would enter 2, then 2 asterisks, which is what we use for exponentiation, and then 4. And when you hit enter, you see result, and then 16, which is indeed 2 to the 4th. Now, in the shell, in the Python shell, which you'll see in the rest of the video, the word result does not show up. Instead, the 16 is all the way over to the left-hand side. So what that means is when you're trying things out within the IPython console, things are going to look a little differently. And in particular, you will see that word result for everything that you enter from the input prompt. So don't be thrown by that. Just expect to get that extra little output prompt which says result. So now we're going to resume the rest of the video, and remember, whenever it talks about the shell, you should enter things in the IPython console. One thing you can do is enter something that involves arithmetic. So for example, you can make use of these operators that are listed here. Most of them are pretty straightforward. It's worth noting that multiplication is done using an asterisk. So 6 times 7 gives me 42. And you can see I can just put that expression and hit enter, and it shows me the result. 2 asterisks give me exponentiation. So here I can compute 2 to the 4th, or 16. And then the other one that you may not have seen before is the modulus or mod operator. We use the percent sign for that, and it gives us the remainder of a division. So for example, 17 mod 2, 2 goes into 17 8 times with a remainder of 1. So we get a 1 there. If I do 17 mod 3, 3 goes into 17 5 times with a remainder of 2. Now, it's important to realize that the operators follow the standard order of operations, the ones you may have seen from high school algebra. For example, multiplication gets done before addition. So if I type in 2 plus 3 times 5, the multiplication is going to get done first, and I end up with 17. If you need to change the order of operations, you can use parentheses. So if I put parentheses around the addition, it will get done first, and I'll get 25. Now, it turns out that there are different what are called data types in Python, and this is true in all languages because different kinds of values are stored differently in the computer's memory, and they're also operated on differently. In Python, there are 2 main types for numbers. There's an integer type, and there's a separate type for numbers that include a decimal, and those are called floating point numbers or floats. Now, it turns out that each data type has its own set of operators. So there are really 2 sets of numeric operators, one for integers, or ints, and one for floating point numbers, or floats. And the way that Python determines which one to use, which operator to use, is based on these rules. If at least one of the operands is a float, the result will be a float because we're using the float operator. But if both of the operands are ints, the result will be an int because we're using the int version of the operator. So for example, if I do 3 plus 7.0, because the 7.0 is a float, it has a decimal, I'm going to use the float addition operator and I get a float result. But if I use two ints, I get an int result. Now that's typically how things work, but there's one really important exception, and that is division. It turns out that if I use the single slash division operator, I'm always going to get a float, regardless of the types of the numbers that I'm dividing. So for example, if I do 5/3, I get this as the result. And that's a good thing because I need a float here to fully capture the result. But notice what happens if I do 6 divided by 3. Ordinarily we would think of that as being an integer result, but I get 2.0. So you always get a float if you use the single slash division operator. Now there is a separate double slash operator for what is called integer division. And here I'm always going to get an int as the result. So now if I do 6/3, I get 2 with no decimal. So here I'm using integer division, no decimal in the result. And this will happen even if we would ordinarily get a fractional part in regular mathematics. So for example, 11/5 gives me 2, not 2.2. So I'm discarding whatever comes after the decimal. 5/3 is going to give me 1. So again, we're throwing away what comes after the decimal. And it's important to realize here that it does not round, right? If it did, 5/3, which is 1.66666, would give me 2. But I'm not getting 2, I'm getting 1 because we're not rounding, we're truncating. And then there's one more type I want to briefly mention. It's the string type. A string in computer science is a sequence of characters or other kinds of symbols. It's used for text in your program. And when we put a string into our code, we need to surround it by either double quotes or single quotes. And I've given you an example of each variation here. It doesn't matter whether you use the double quotes or the single quotes.